My name's Lara Hargrave. I'm with Great Notion Brewing, and here's Craft Beer and Brewing's Tip of the Week. We're gonna start from the very beginning, which is recipe development, and we're gonna start with malts. We need a base malt, and then we have all of our specialty dark malts. And when creating this, obviously you're gonna look at the ABV. Pastry stouts tend to be 8% higher most of the time. Great Notion, we go big or go home. So ours are around from 10 to 11%. We get a good base malt of a Maris Otter, and then we add our dark malts as well, depending on what stout we're doing. It depends on which dark malts that we're gonna use. We love using Carafe from Weyermann is a great one. It adds a really dark, kind of rich profile look to it without killing it on the flavor and letting other things shine. We use Maris Otter. It is a little bit more pricier than say 2-row. We use it because one, it has more body. It has a lot to stand up to, and if it's gonna be your base malt, it needs to have the backbone. It also isn't as acidic as 2-row. And this is especially important with all the dark roasted grains that we're gonna add. And it's gonna acidify your mash, and you don't want that. That is gonna make your beer kind of taste acrid towards the end, and then when you're adding coffees and all this, that could clash. So when building a recipe, we are gonna use Maris Otter, and that's around 70% of our grain bill. The other 30% is kind of split evenly amongst, like I said, Carafe. We'll use roasted barley, say in double stack. It might not be in our other beers, but we do like it in that beer. We also use a good amount of flaked oats to kind of give that creamy mouthfeel as well, along with some wheat. And we've been starting to add a little bit of Munich to some of our pastry stouts. We really like the body and kind of backbone that it also complements with the Maris Otter. We will use things like roasted barley and say brown malt, which kind of you would think associate that with like an Irish stout as kind of offering bittering. Why would you want that in a pastry stout? Because the gravity finish is so high and it's a little bit sweeter. And it's also, we're adding a good amount of maple syrup to it. So that sweetness is really gonna kind of need that bitterness, so it's not too cloying of a mouthfeel. The roasted barley is around 3% of the grist for, say, double stack. So it's not a lot, but it is enough to kind of give it a little bit of bitterness to kind of help with that sweetness that it is going to finish at. The other things that are in there are around 1 to 6% at the most. The flaked oats are a little bit higher. We do rely on the dark malt as bitterness as well as the hops. We don't use many hops in our pastry stouts simply because they're just not necessary in higher amounts. So a good couple pounds of a Columbus or something just to offer some bitterness. And that way it doesn't take away from the roasted barley, and that way it also balances with the sweetness that you want in a pastry stout. Great Notion really doesn't do mid-tones. We're all about the finishing. I think that's important on our end, is just you kind of have that wow factor of the maple syrup and the coffee. I think things like coffee and cocoa nibs especially, we use a good amount of those, and those can be acidic, those can be astringent. Having those, you don't want those dark malts to clash with it too, and it just kind of makes your mouth dry, chalky, it can be tannic. So you do need to be careful with that in your recipe development as well. Carafe, I love. We use it, it has a great color to it. If you just look at it at the wort, just this really nice, dark, rich, like black coffee color. It does have flavor to it. I don't think it's fair to completely call it neutral. What I would say is it's not overwhelming. It does offer kind of those roasty, toasty kind of coffee notes that you would expect. If anyone's ever had maybe a Schwartz beer or something, that probably has a little Carafe because you don't want it to take over, and I love it for that reason. We're using a lot of different specialty malts to kind of give it complexity. So we have some chocolate rye, which we know is very chocolatey, a little bit of spice. We have some brown malt to kind of give it that old school porter feel to it. We have the Carafe, as I said, to give it a boost in color and not overwhelm in flavor. We have wheat in there as well for body. The oats are gonna give a nice creaminess to it, which we all want in our pastry stouts. We have all these different kind of specialty malts, as I mentioned, the chocolate rye, the brown malts. They all offer kind of these little nuances to help balance out the bitterness with the sweetness, and then the adjuncts that we're gonna add towards the end. When mashing all of these darker malts are pretty acidic, and you don't want those acidic malts to shine because they can make your beer kind of chalky, acrid, kind of just gross. So we do pay attention to the pH when we mash in. We use a lot of sodium bicarbonate, AKA baking soda. Baking soda is gonna raise your pH, which is what we want. It's also gonna add some ions to it. The amount that we use is gonna give it more of a full-bodied mouthfeel, which is what we want. We don't add any acid to our mashes at all because our dark specialty malts are acting as the acid. So none of that. That's another reason why we don't use 2-row, because 2-row is a little bit more acidic and we just don't want that. All of our beers, we have our main grain bill, which is Maris Otter, and then our specialties. And when we do it, we kind of split it into 3 ways. So half of the Maris Otter will go in, then we'll do the specialty malts in the middle, and then we'll grain in the rest of the Maris Otter. And that way, in the middle of mashing in, you'll start to hit your dark malts. And it's a lot of grain. It's a lot of grain for our lauter tun. Our lauter tun is doing a very good job. It's holding on for its dear life. I always recommend we use rice hulls. You don't have to use as many as you would think because those dark malts are gonna help the lautering process because they are a little bit drier. But you do need to use a little bit of that. We also use bioglucanase, which is a starch enzyme, which helps just take the starches and makes it more fermentable. And it only, for our 30 barrels, we only need like 30 milliliters. It's very little, but it does help with your lautering as well. As I mentioned, we use our salts. The most important thing is the pH. So we do use around 100 parts per million of baking soda in the mashing in process. And then further down, when we get to the kettle, I can adjust it with pickling lime, which is a more neutral flavor. We do use a good amount of oats, about 400 pounds in some of our pastry stouts. And I will do that around 3/4 of the way in. I don't want to do it towards the very end because I do want them to get submerged in water and grain and kind of get mixed in. So I do it, yeah, like I said, 3/4 in. You don't want to add it too soon. If you add it too soon, you're going to get a stuck mash. You don't want that. So 3/4 of the way in is usually really good for that. Anything that's going to be a high ABV, so if we're looking at like 11%, our mash temp's going to be pretty low. So 148, which is about that's like a lager temp. We want as much of this to dry out as possible. We're going to create a pretty hostile environment for the yeast, so we want to make them as happy as we can in that hostile environment. We do use maltodextrin in the kettle. That is an unfermentable sugar, and that will also give sweetness. And we want to kind of to be able to control the sweetness. So we want all the sugars in the malt to ferment out, and then the maltodextrin is going to act as a sweetener, and we can control that. We don't want any sort of stalled fermentation or any sort of unexpected gravity that we weren't planning for in the end. To learn more about brewing pastry stouts, click the link below.